Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatsoever about that. Scrooge himself had tied his former partner's hands with ivy while he sharpened the stake. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the sole mourner. Scrooge had watched every moment to be sure the revenant was buried with all necessary ceremony. His hatred of Christmas was well known. What was less well known were his reasons. The season of joy, of open arms, hearts, and homes was prime hunting territory for them. They snuck in at the season of cheer, and took what had been grumpy, complex, glorious, and above all, human, and replaced it with a hollow shell of holiday cheer. And then, well, then. Mind, I don't mean to say that Scrooge had reasons to be miserly, particularly to the extremes he adopted. He was as covetous an old sinner as had ever lost a war for want of a stake of holly. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. In avoiding the appearance of false generosity, by which they were marked, he had fallen into the error of parsimony, and by now had hardened so far that those who knew him never so much as suspected any chance of human warmth. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human and inhuman sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing call nuts to Scrooge. On the eve of the blessed holiday that was such a terror to the sensibilities of such a man as Ebenezer Scrooge, the visit of his nephew, his sole remaining relative, jangled his sore nerves fearfully. His nephew had no notion of the forces attracted by his generous nature, had no knowledge of the stresses that had carried his mother, Scrooge's beloved younger sister, to her early grave. As Scrooge had never learned to overcome the circumlocution in which he had been carefully trained, he was gruff and skeptical, rather than clearly warning of the danger that Fred courted. He forgot himself only once, when he spoke of the holly, but there was no betraying glitter in his nephew's eyes, no sign that his cheer was anything other than human. Scrooge's dismissal was tinged with the faint relief that was all he allowed himself to feel. He might last for years, even decades yet, but he was, he felt, getting far too old to continue on with the secret war which humanity had warred for as long as cheer had fought with the dark of the year. It was, perhaps, far too fitting that they had adopted the trappings of the holiday, so that they might better work their way in. He eyed his clerk with disfavor. Though the man had come well recommended, he could tell that he had no stomach for the fight, had no skill with which to see below the surface to the evil rolling underneath. Bob Cratchit had no idea that his poverty was the only blind by which his generous nature had not yet attracted their attention. They loved bright, shiny baubles, conspicuous displays of wealth, all of those social signifiers that showed flash and no substance. When his clerk requested the day off, Scrooge begrudgingly allowed it, knowing that to keep him off the street during this darkest time of the year was the only mercy of which he was yet capable. And so it was, perhaps, that he was not as observant as he might otherwise have been, after his usual dismal dinner in his melancholy tavern, that he did not take note of how his doorknob, having been until this moment quite ordinary, if large, took on the aspect of his deceased partner. If he had not dismissed the glimpse he had of Marley's tormented features as the product of an overwrought imagination, fired up by the stresses of seeing the echo of his sister's beloved features in a face far too unaware of its peril, he might have averted the circumstances yet to come. Of course, for one who knew of the existence of the insinuating kind, the appearance of spirits came as no surprise. Scrooge's banter with the ghost of Marley, translucent and wrapped in chains, was partly from relief that his partner's soul still seemed intact. When Marley began to remonstrate with Scrooge about his miserly nature, the latter responded with indignation, pointing out that wanton cheer was a call to those whose interference had culled Marley's life short. Nevertheless, the spirit proclaimed, had I many years more on the earth, my chain would be all the greater. It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. I forged this chain in life, made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. The chain you bear was as full and heavy as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. Scrooge trembled and begged for comfort. He did not notice how the air behind him shivered, and how a sense of glitter hung for a moment, as if waiting for the next words. Mercy shall come from sources other than mine, Marley's ghost continued. You shall be haunted by 3 spirits, that you may learn the lessons that they tell, so that charity may open up your heart ere it is too late. Haunted? Scrooge replied, his countenance falling low. What mercy is that? It is, the ghost said, the only way that you may avoid my fate. Beware. Shun the path I tread in life, that you might not have such an ignominious death. With this last, he fixed his eye upon Scrooge, as if reminding him how that end had come about. Scrooge shrank back, fearing blame, but the spirit merely faded, and all became dim once more. It was difficult for Scrooge to sleep that night, knowing what was to occur. When the clock struck 1 and the room was lit as though by a bright spring sun, he knew that the first of the spirits had arrived. He attempted to bear it bravely and shook the curtains back to see a tiny figure glowing brightly, whitely, and somehow cleanly. Every inch of his training told him to be wary, yet every instinct of him inclined to trust. The spirit, diminutive, clutched in his hand a bouquet of holly. Habit had Scrooge checking its end for sharpness, even as his relief emboldened him. Who and what are you? Scrooge demanded. I am the ghost of Christmas past. Long past? Inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. No, your past. Rise and walk with me. The spirit took Scrooge's arm, and by some means drew him forward until they came to a building that Scrooge long recognized. It has been his school, his home, and his only solace for many a year, and lonely at Christmas time, he had longed to return home for years. The spirit showed him seated solitary by the fire, with books scrounged from the school's portable library, for several years as he grew to be a man. And then came that last Christmas, as the door opened and his sister Frances, little Fan, came darting in. I have come to bring you home, dear brother, said the child, clapping her tiny hands. Home, for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. The youth that was Scrooge laughed with his sister, while the older Scrooge, with the spirit, wept. Yes, Father had been much kinder, so much so that they had not noticed the strange glitter in his eyes, nor how Frances gradually lost ground, beginning to cough as though with a consumption. They had not seen how what little wealth the family owned was frittered away, until there was scarce enough to see Fan married and Scrooge placed. They had not known what to look for until it was far too late. The ghost next took Scrooge to a certain warehouse door, and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Scrooge did, and rejoiced at the sight of Fezziwig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick, yo-ho, my boys, no more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick, Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up. The young man that had been Scrooge and his fellow apprentice made quick work of the job. Before he could quite count to a dozen, the shutters were placed and pinned, and while Dick set to sweeping and watering the floor, trimming the lamps, and heaping fuel upon the fire, the young Ebenezer set to hanging holly and ivy to brighten the room. The older Scrooge noted the last with surprise. He had quite forgotten the traditional protections were known to all and sundry. He watched as the fiddler and all of the guests came in, including a much younger Jacob Marley, who broke off a short piece of holly and turned it in his fingers as the dancers went through their figures. He laughed as the dancers got into a snarl and straightened out again, turning up in the wrong places. He watched the forfeits and the cake and the young Miss Fezziwigs and the suitors whose hearts they broke. And when he thought that his heart was full, the ghost led him outside as the domestic ball broke up, and they watched the young men, stumbling slightly from drink and fatigue, filter out. Jacob Marley, as silent as before, followed but lightly in the footsteps of one young man whose drunken stumbles smoothed out as soon as he was out of the sight of the door, gliding as though his feet no longer quite touched the ground. Scrooge watched as Marley crept up on that one, who turned and hissed, eyes glinting as though lit from behind. Scrooge put a hand to his mouth, for he had accepted that his former fellow-apprentice had disappeared, perhaps lost to the cold hours of the long night. He had not realized that Dick had been lost long before. It had been the very day after Christmas, he now recalled, that Marley had hired him away from Fezziwig and had begun to train him in the long fight. By then his sister had fallen too far to be saved, dying shortly after she had her son and leaving her husband bereft. Scrooge's heart was so full of regret for his younger sister that he scarcely noticed when the ghost brought him before the young woman to whom he had once been engaged. As she broke the contract, claiming that he worshipped the shrine of gain, he searched her face for some sign that she had been tainted. He did not know if he was sorry or relieved to find no such mark upon her features. When the spirit left him, alone and troubled in his curtained bed, he was unsure of what to make of his experience. True, he felt remorse for his pursuit of money to the exclusion of his fellow man, but he still dreaded the fate that had befallen those around him, and which still stalked the streets of foggy London town. As the clock chimed the hour, he awaited with fearful anticipation his next revelations.